I think a lot of people are aware of Ava Gardner. When they hear the name, they think, oh yes, married to Frank Sinatra, very beautiful. But I think very few of us really know her intimately as a film actress.
Ava's public persona in the mid-1950s was of this hard-partying diva, someone who drank a lot, someone who was difficult to work with, someone who was late to the set, someone who just didn't care.
With Ava, her whole life was sort of like a film. I think people have said that her greatest part was her life.
Did you know that I'm a swinging cook?
Sounds like I've got myself a good deal.
You might have, Jakes. A very good deal. I'll make you 2 promises. A very good steak, medium rare. And the truth, which is very rare.
There were certainly many Avas, and different people saw different facades of her personality. She was a very authentic person, and she was full of contradictions, and I think she herself was often confused by herself.
A lot of people said that when she was growing up, she wasn't very remarkable. She didn't stand out. No one ever thought that she would go off and become famous. Ava was born in 1922 on Christmas Eve. Her dad was a sharecropper in rural North Carolina. She grew up very poor.
I think a lot has been made of the fact that she always searched for the father figure. Ava lost her father very young. I think his death left a massive void in her life, something she tried all her life to fill.
I'll bet you were a tough little girl.
I still am, for the wrong guy.
And for the right guy.
For the right guy? For the right guy, Vic, I'm not so tough.
Her brother-in-law, Larry Tarr, was a photographer who had a studio in Fifth Avenue, and he took a photograph of her that he put in the window of his shop. This employee of Lowe's Inc. saw the picture, told his friends at MGM. They decided to bring her up to New York again for a screen test. She had a very thick accent, so unfortunately, this test was silent, and her looks were good enough for Louis B. Mayer.
The studio didn't really know what kind of parts would suit her. She didn't really fit the mold that was expected of her.
She was the sort of perfect embodiment of the star system in Hollywood, where the studios manufactured people. They didn't nurture talent so much. They plucked people off the street, brought them in, and then transformed them into something that they really weren't.
You don't approve of me, do you?
Does that matter?
No, not really.
It was really an education. She underwent this very strict training. She had to learn how to speak properly. She had to learn how to dance, how to pose in front of the camera. So it was a grueling, long process before she was really ready for stardom.
Isn't it nice we're both in the same business? Makes everything so much cozier, don't you think so?
Yes, Gene. Everything's just as cozy as it can be.
Ava Gardner met Mickey Rooney on her first day at MGM. And there's a really funny story of her first seeing Mickey Rooney. He came out and he was dressed like Carmen Miranda for a scene in this film where he was wearing, you know, like a big fruit hat, and he came out doing his little cha-cha. Mickey was completely taken by Ava when he first saw her, and so he immediately phoned her up that evening, said, "Will you go out with me?" She said no. He kept asking her, she kept turning him down, and I think he kind of wore her down, and eventually she said, okay. She was basically married to MGM. I mean, Mickey was one of the biggest stars at MGM at the time, and I don't think Mickey's goal was to be a husband. It was just, you know, to get Ava Gardner, this beautiful girl who was new on the lot. And so their marriage broke up after about a year. Ava didn't have very much confidence in herself as an actress, but also her confidence as a person really took a knock when she married Artie Shaw. Artie Shaw was psychologically abusive toward her, but for Ava, being married to this intellectual person who ran in these intellectual circles, I think she felt like she wasn't good enough. Her natural instinct was to read things like a popular novel at the time called Forever Amber by an author called Kathleen Winsor. And there's a story of Artie Shaw seeing her reading that, plucking it out of her hands and saying, "What is this trash?" and not letting her read it. The interesting thing about that is Artie Shaw ended up divorcing Ava and marrying Kathleen Winsor, the author of Forever Amber. And so it was it was just like kind of an awful situation.
I want you to meet the little sweetheart of the South, our songstress and leading lady, Miss Julie Laverne.
It wasn't really until the early 1950s that she kind of took off as a big star in the way that we would think of someone like Joan Crawford or Bette Davis. It was really with films like Showboat, films that maybe showed her in Technicolor, so they really enhanced her beauty and showcased that.
You look at me sometimes with such a strange questioning in your eyes. If it's a question of my love, you have the answer.
With Pandora and the Flying Dutchman, we really start seeing Ava as we remember her today, this full-blown star, and I think she comes to her own.
Would you like me to destroy your painting?
Not at all.
The style of her performance, which is very much based around her being very natural, her reacting to her co-stars, there was nothing sort of learned, or there was no method involved in her acting. When her character suddenly realizes that she's capable of a romantic sacrifice, of loving another person, she goes from playing those sleek sort of femme fatales, which are really quite one-dimensional, to playing those more complex women who are tormented by their personal lives.
It's as if everything that happened before I met you didn't happen to me at all, but to someone else.
Ava's relationship with Frank Sinatra is something that, sadly, she is probably most remembered for. If you mention Ava Gardner to anyone, they probably will say, "Oh, wasn't she married to Frank Sinatra?" And you say, "Yes, she was." So I think even though it was a relatively brief chapter in her life, it really defined her in terms of her public persona. It was such a huge scandal when they got together. He was still married. So Ava was branded a homewrecker and a Jezebel.
They had a very passionate relationship, but at the same time, a very sort of turbulent relationship. As Frank's star was sort of on the downward slope, Ava's was on the upward slope. And so I don't think they ever got along very well as a married couple. They spent a lot of time away from each other and also fought quite a lot. And as Tina Sinatra told Anthony and I, Ava wasn't going to be tied down by one person.
I think what we have to remember about Ava Gardner is that at the time she really was the movie star. I mean, her name alone brought images of glamour and beauty and this sort of exotic otherness. And I think what set her apart from other actresses in Hollywood at that time was precisely the fact that she didn't live in Hollywood. At the height of her career, she left not only Hollywood but the United States, and she lived in Spain and then in London. So there was really this very foreign, very exotic aura attached to her image.
Europe afforded her an amount of freedom that she didn't feel that she had. She could do what she wanted. She could stay out all night if she wanted. She could drink all night if she wanted. She could dance flamenco all night if she wanted, and no one was there to tell her no.
She didn't want that sort of iron fist of MGM over her anymore, and she didn't want to answer to anyone. It's the films that she made after that, in my mind, are the most interesting. She really comes to her own, and her style changes because she gets rid of all that artificiality that was part of her MGM years. I think what's very important about The Snows of Kilimanjaro is that what happens on the screen really mirrors what was happening in Ava's life at that time. The character falls pregnant, and Ava as well, with Frank Sinatra, to whom she was married at the time. And both the character and Ava herself face this very difficult decision of whether they want to have the baby or not.
Ava had an abortion while she was filming. The first one, she didn't tell him what was happening. She went ahead and did it on her own. And I think she felt that she couldn't raise a child in a relationship that was so fraught and so unstable. You know, at the time, there was a lot of sexism in the industry. There was thought that it was okay for men to be adulterous and to have affairs, but if women did that, they were considered sluts, basically. And Ava did not take well to slut shaming. Ava said, I'm gonna say this on camera, you can totally edit it, but she said, "That's bullshit, honey," and she didn't like that at all.
What do you want?
You're a beautiful woman, Ellie.
Don't tell me after all this time you're making a pass, Jakes.
The window's open, you could always scream.
Her performance in 7 Days in May came after she didn't act in films for about 3 years. She sort of had a break because she didn't feel very confident after a couple of her films were sort of box office disappointments. She plays this aging party girl with a sort of romantic past. And it could have easily become a caricature, sort of self-parody, but instead, Ava really injects so much emotion and so much personal history into this character.
Look, Ellie.
That was dirty pool, Jakes. You didn't come here to salvage me.
In her apartment where Kirk Douglas comes to visit her, and she has to really go on this journey.
Scott didn't want to dirty his hands collecting those letters. But Colonel Casey is always ready to clean up the general's privy.
The stage adaptation of The Night of the Iguana starred Bette Davis in the part of Maxine, obviously one of the great actresses of the time. And Tennessee Williams actually hated Bette Davis's interpretation. He didn't like what she did with Maxine. And he turned to John Huston, who was directing the film, and said, "I think we should do something totally different in the film version." And John Huston from the very beginning saw Ava as the perfect Maxine. So Huston had to travel to Madrid to convince her to do this film. And they spent 3 days and 3 nights sort of partying all over Madrid. By the end of it, he was absolutely exhausted, but he was convinced more than ever that she was the right choice for the part. With Ava, she was very insecure about doing that film. To her, Tennessee Williams meant serious drama and sort of great, classically trained actors. It took all of Huston's talent as a director, which by all accounts he possessed. He was there with her every step of the way.
May I make a further suggestion, Maxine? Why don't you go moonlight bathing with your beach boys? Don't let my presence stop you, any more than old Fred's presence used to stop.
You bastard.
There's a beautiful scene in the film where she's sort of dancing with her beach boys. There was something very raw and very sort of personal about that scene, and she was terrified. And there's a story that John Huston sort of actually took his pants off and took the camera and walked into the sea with her. So he was very close, and he was there almost holding her hand, saying, you know, "Ava, you can do it, you can do it." He really believed in her.
I'm fed up with this place. Fed up to the teeth and to the gums and the jawbone. Jungle rut set in.
Where are you going?
Well, I'm not going on any of your Blake tours, that's for sure. I'm heading north. El Paso, maybe. Yeah, I like El Paso.
She remained a star for the rest of her life. She did still do bit parts in films.
Ava often said that she only continued to make movies for the money. I think to a large degree that's true, but I don't think it's the whole truth. I think that working in films was the only sort of thing that she knew, really.
She always looked down on the film industry, and part of it may have been because she felt that she was never really encouraged to become a great actress.
I think deep down she really wanted people to see that, but she was very insecure, which is why I think she turned down some very important films in the 60s and 70s, like The Graduate, like The Pink Panther, like Sweet Bird of Youth.
When she died, she was brought back to North Carolina, so it was like she came home finally. She was buried in Smithfield. Her family was there. And Frank Sinatra actually paid for the funeral.
Frank Sinatra was, by all accounts, the love of her life, and she was the love of his life. Even though they separated and divorced in 1957, they were never really out of each other's life. His daughter told us that when Ava died, he was broken-hearted. He couldn't speak for 24 hours. He sort of locked himself in a room and was devastated. The one thing that really struck me when researching the book was that No matter who we spoke to, whether it was Sinatra's children or people who worked with Ava or her co-stars or her neighbors, everyone remembered her really fondly and with love, which is really beautiful, I think, and it's really indicative of the kind of person she was.